As an athlete, I've always been remembered for my level of conditioning, and working with Mike Ferguson at the power station in Cincinnati, his philosophy was real simple. We're going to grind until you feel like quitting. And when you're ready to quit, we will just grind some more. Now, given that I had a background in mathematics, I've always been interested in things that are numbers driven and data. But it wasn't until I went to Seattle to work with Matt Hume where I met Joel Jamieson, who runs End Zone Athletics. Now, Joel at the time was a pioneer in heart rate variability systems, or HRV. Many of you may not know what HRV is, but if you're wearing a gadget like a Garmin, a Fitbit, an Oura Ring, an Apple Watch, then it's most likely using an HRV system. And what this HRV does is it measures the nervous system. To put in layman's terms, both the fight or flight system as well as the relaxation system. And they will essentially measure what the previous day or days have done to your body and its ability to recover from that. Anything from the training that you've gone through, as well as just lifestyle factors. So today, Joel and I have a discussion about training and what training means for different kinds of athletes and how that affects recovery, what recovery actually is, and then how you can use this technology to not only measure, but help manage to optimize not just physical output for someone that's training to be an elite athlete or even a hobbyist, but how it can also measure and manage lifestyle factors for maybe the corporate worker as well.
Quite frankly, it's kind of unusual.
It's quite Franklin.
Got it. Quite Franklin.
Appreciate you coming on, man. And it's good to see you.
Yeah, I think the last time I might have seen you in person, like think about it, is at the Arnold Classic in Columbus, like
other
years
than
ago.
Personal stuff, because I was up in Seattle just, like year and a half back or whatever, 2 years when we were riding the snow machines.
Yeah.
That's how.
That's right. I forgot
That's
about
how
that.
insignificant my time with you is, apparently. So yeah, you and I talked earlier this week, and we decided we wanted to talk about recovery for training, or we would focus on that aspect of it, because talk about training, there's so many different directions that we could go and stuff like that. And so, I'll say this: in my career when I was competing, being down here in Cincinnati, I did a lot of. Obviously, I did a lot of training with Mike Ferguson before I came up there. Old school methods of training, just push yourself to the brink. And then I come up to Seattle, and you started plugging me into things like an HRV recovery system and just different methods of computerization and technology that I had never really incorporated into my training before. So it kind of opened my eyes to a whole different system of training, recovery, and how you approach things. Because there was a couple times when we would come in and you would test me, you would stick those little suction cups on my body, and I would
electrodes, old school style. Yep.
Yeah. And I would feel great. And, I'm like, I'm ready to go. And you're like, no, you're tired today. So we're going to have to adjust the training accordingly. And I'm like, huh, what? And then there are days where I come in and I feel run down, and then the computer system would say, you're good to go. And I'm like, huh, what? And so this was definitely a learning experience for me from, as an athlete, and that aspect of my career. So let's start with like training approach. Let me just say this before we get into that. I want to talk about training and training approach, and then we'll jump right into recovery. But when we're talking about training and training approach, will this matter if we're talking about, say, somebody the hobbyist versus the elite athlete?
Yeah, look, now the reality is the body, right? The fundamentals of how the body functions, how the body adapts to training, how the body responds to life. None of those things change, whether you're trying to, get ready for a fight, or you're just trying to live a longer life without, falling dead of cardiovascular disease or cancer or whatever. So the fundamental principles of how all this works really remain the same. The difference is maybe how you're going to train, what exercise you're going to do, how much training you can do. Those things change, but the basic principles underlying stress, recovery, health, performance, those things really don't, because we're all built fundamentally the same. We just have different genetics and different capabilities. But, underlying software is more or less the same.
So when we're coming in the gym and training, because obviously, particularly in my career, and me as an athlete, you and I have worked together plenty at this point in time to know that I just pushed myself to the brink of near death, basically. I mean, obviously coaches are there for the motivated athlete to pull the reins when it's supposed to be done, right? I mean, because if you said to me, Rich, today we're walking through brick walls, then I'm going to try to walk through brick walls. So when you're in these training principles, obviously this is different for elite athletes versus, say, just the average person. How much does the average person have to actually grind like that in order to, well, combat cancer, heart disease, things of that nature? Like, how much do they have to grind like a professional athlete in order to?
The answer is you need enough intensity to cause the body to get to a certain level of fitness where it's protective, right? Like you can't walk every day and improve your fitness to the highest extent possible or to the extent necessary. But at the same point in time, if you go too hard, too often, too long, you're going down the other side where your body's just not going to recover. Its health's not going to ultimately improve. So for everybody, there's a different amount of that, I would say, depending on what someone's genetics are, what their training background is, how high of a health level is really necessary to just live a longer life. But on average, just kind of give you here's just a general guideline. I would say twice a week is where someone needs to really push their heart rates up to the higher limits. And by that, I mean, 85, 90% of their maximum heart rate twice a week for the average person. It doesn't have to be a lot. It could be 10, 15, 20 minutes. It doesn't need to be, a combat session that you guys are doing for your sparring for multiple rounds. Just getting your heart rate up to that higher level a couple times a week is really all that the average person needs. And that's, once they've built up to it. If someone's literally just, hey, I need to get my ass off the couch, you really don't need to do it more than once every couple of weeks. It's going to grow over time how much you need, but it doesn't definitely is not a day in, day out, grind yourself into the ground like a, pro athlete. Even pro athletes, I'll say it's probably not really the best long-term sustainable approach because you have to push the body, then you have to give it a chance to recover and adapt and improve from that training. If you're so busy at overloading, you're not recovering, then ultimately you're just not going to see the gains from what the work you just put in.
Yeah, I would say it's fair to say that the professional athlete, they're probably, too hard, too often, too long is just the standard training for a professional athlete. And I would argue that what the professional athlete does is actually counterproductive to health.
I mean, it absolutely is. I think that there's been a bigger emphasis on, better management and better recovery as of late. And, it's funny that you mentioned the old school technology. I was putting electrodes on you with little suction cups. That was heart rate variability. I mean, back when we were doing it, you say heart rate variability, people think you have an STD, but now HRV is literally in Apple Watches, right? I mean, Apple, the biggest, it's in Apple Watches, it's in Google or Garmin, it's HRVs everywhere these days. So the technology has really evolved to where, I don't have to stick electrodes on everybody anymore. But there has been an increased importance, I think, placed on recovery. Teams are getting more around it. People are using URAs and people are paying more attention to this stuff like our own technology, Morpheus. But there's still a long way to go. And I think that's just because the mindset of athletes for so long is, but I'm going to outwork the next guy, right? Like I'm going to, especially combat athletes, like I'm going to train harder than the guy I'm going to be facing in the cage. And it becomes this big contest of how hard and how long and how hard you can go, how much you can endure. But that's a very short-sighted strategy because you can only do that for so long before you do end up breaking. And I think, most athletes are not like you. They don't spend as much time outside the training, focusing on sleep, eating well, not drinking, but taking care of their bodies, getting soft tissue work. I think that's really what allowed you to do those things for as long as you did, because you were one of the few who went to such great lengths to do all the things outside of the gym that helped your recovery and help your body be able to repair itself. You take the average athlete who's not doing those things, and that's why you see people burn out so early in their careers and they get injured and they never able to sustain their performance the length that you were able to because you did put so much work into outside.
Well, I'll
the
tell
training.
you what a lot of athletes don't take into consideration is the fact that you don't just burn out physically if you're not spending the proper time recovering. And this is kind of like, I don't want to get all philosophical or anything, but living a balanced life, right? As an athlete, you'll go through a 10-week, 12-week training camp, and then you fight, and then you'll see athletes, particularly athletes that have lost a match, and they want to get right back in. And I've been guilty of this. I lost on a Friday or Saturday night, and I want to get right back in the gym on a Monday because you immediately want to correct the wrong. I mean, you're only as good as your last fight in your head. And so, when it comes to recovery, it's not just what you're doing after the workout, if you're getting those massages, if you're doing the ice baths, if you're doing proper sleep, not drinking, but are you actually taking time in between camps and letting your body really just recover from all the stress that you put on your system? Because you made a comment a few minutes back when I was asking about intensity and how often you should do that. When you're talking about just doing the intensity, even as a casual hobbyist, just once or twice a week, I mean, basically what you're really just doing is disrupting the nervous system, correct?
Yeah. I mean, the stress and intensity is just a continuum, right? Like you can put in a low amount of stress for a lot of volume, or you put in a high amount of stress for a smaller volume. They both have benefits. So you're just pushing the cardiovascular system and the central nervous system, and even the autonomic nervous system to its higher capacities or to its limits so that it's forced to adapt. I mean, that's just what it comes down to. The higher intensities cause a greater disruption, which causes a greater adaptation or greater response.
When I travel, so I mean, I'm on the road quite a bit sometimes, and there'll be times where I step out of training and then I'll come back in and I'll grapple or I'll spar or something like that. And maybe I haven't done any real cardio for, let's say, a month, like real proper training. And so people would expect me to step back in the gym, and then my cardio is just wrecked. I start to get fatigued at midway through a second round or something like that. And when they see my cardio performing, they're like, well, what do you do? And I'm like, well, I do these high intensity sprints for, you and I talked about this back when we were training, like that Tabata style sprinting, where you're basically doing like a 9-minute work where it's like a 2 on, 1 off, 2 on, 1 off, 2 on, 1 off. And I would just do something short like that when I'm on the road to really push myself, because like stressing my nervous system out like that is enough for me to maintain, at least at a base level, the intensity that I'm able to perform at.
Yeah, I mean, the more stress you put your body under, the bigger the reaction, right? So ultimately, the fewer times you have to do it, and the more stable that becomes over time. Now, you've been training your whole life, and you've been, creating this massive foundation. So for you, it's fairly easy for you to maintain that with just, periodic here and there. And if you miss a week or two, you're probably not going to notice a huge difference. Now, somebody who's just getting started, if they take a week or two off, they're probably going to have a much more noticeable decrease, because they just haven't built that foundation. Your physiology has been built like this for 20, 30 years. So it's very easy for someone like you to maintain that, versus, like I said, a newcomer. But regardless, the intensity is the thing that's able to just maintain that. But the problem is when people think that intensity is the only piece of this, and then they just think that every day I need to do high intensity because they see this, twice a week is good, 5 times a week is better. But it doesn't work that way, because you're missing out on the balance piece of that, which is the recovery aspect.
Okay, so when you talk about increasing your heart rate a couple times a week, there are 2 different ways to increase your heart rate. Obviously, if I put a bunch of heavy weight on my back and I'm doing some squats, I'm going to get my heart rate up really high. And, especially even low rep sets are going to get my heart rate up in a different kind of way that, for example, running a 5K would. The difference between these two, for say the hobbyist versus I guess it applies the same for the hobbyist as well as the elite athlete. Like what's the importance of both of these things from a heart rate perspective and actually exercising the heart? Because they both exercise the heart in 2 different ways.
Yeah, they do in very different ways. The reality is lifting weights for cardiovascular fitness is not very effective. If it was, then bodybuilders and power lifters would be in great shape, but they're not, right? And the reason for it is largely blood pressure. So if you think about your cardiovascular system and specifically the blood vessels like hoses, part of how the body adapts is those hoses become more well-developed, to become more elastic, more efficient. The heart itself becomes more elastic. And you develop these qualities because the blood pressure is not super high when you're doing moderate or even higher intensity, low resistance type work. And it allows those hoses to stretch over time and the heart to stretch, and it gets bigger and more efficient, all that sort of stuff. But when you're lifting weights, because you're under tremendous load and pressure and all those muscles are contracting, your blood pressure shoots up. Your blood pressure can go over 200 and significantly up in the 200s when you are lifting heavy weights. And that blood pressure causes a very different response by the heart and by the blood vessels. Rather than being kind of elastic and able to stretch, they have to be very rigid, because they have to basically resist that blood force, right? The blood is massively at high pressures because of all that strain. And so it causes a very different reaction, basically. Instead of the heart being more elastic and stretching, it tends to get more dense, more firm and less elastic. So if you look at the heart of a power lifter, right? They're doing 1 or 2 or 3 reps or 5 reps or whatever, and they're just max effort all the time. They do very little lower intensity cardiovascular work. You see an extremely differently developed heart and cardiovascular system than you do in, let's say, a marathon runner, for example. Those are opposite in the spectrum. Now, for health benefits, the reality is the marathon runner is going to have a much more healthy cardiovascular system with respect to like aging and all that sort of stuff. The strength side of things plays more of a role on metabolic side and maintaining joint integrity and the ability to move around as you age, all those sorts of things.
Bone density.
Bone density, exactly. So I would say metabolically, like from a general health standpoint, you need to lift weights for multiple reasons, but cardiovascular health is probably not really the biggest one. You need to do cardiovascular health for cardiovascular work. You need to do strength work for strength work. It's easy to think that just because your heart rate goes up, it's the same thing. But fundamentally, it's not. And like the biggest test of that is take a bodybuilder, ask them to run a mile, and watch them fall over 30 seconds into it, right? Or a power lifter. It just doesn't translate that well, the way you might think, because the heart's being driven by 2 different things. The heart rate in a heavy lift is being driven by adrenaline and a big piece of it. The heart rate being driven up in cardiovascular exercise is being driven by the demand for oxygen. So
you say that you can't use weightlifting for cardiovascular, but what about like volume lifting though? Like a high intensity, but a high rep volume lifting, circuit training, things like that.
Yeah, if you're using lighter weights, higher volumes, then yes. Like I said, the key is just what's your blood pressure, and you're straining and your max effort and your 8 to 10 reps and you're under fatigue. Again, that's driving your blood pressure really high, and it's largely driving your heart rate again through adrenaline to cause a greater muscular contraction. But if we're doing cardiovascular exercise, the heart rate's going up because it has to deliver more oxygen to the working muscles. It's a different mechanism in place. So yeah, as long as you're resistant, I'm not saying you can't do any weightlifting. There's no crossover. I would just say the traditional like bodybuilding style, powerlifting style, Olympic weightlifting styles, that's really not going to have a huge cardiovascular benefit relative to just doing cardiovascular exercise. But that doesn't mean you can't use any weightlifting at all or have any strength training in your cardiovascular program. It can be. It's just a different type of lifting.
A quick lesson about training specificity when I was in Japan about 2 years ago now, 2.5, and we climbed Mount Fuji, and I was in a cycle of my lifting phase where I was lifting heavy and I was doing these deadlifts and trying to get back to like a 550 deadlift again. And so working all these low reps, staying in like a 6 to 8 rep range. And then we go to climb Fuji, which is obviously, I don't know, have you ever climbed Fuji before?
I haven't climbed Fuji. I've been by it a bunch of times. Never got to climb it.
So we got to climb it 2 weeks before the season started, and it was still snow capped. None of the trails were open yet. And they say that about 10,000 people summit Fuji a day, and there's only 4 trails at the top. So we summited Fuji, and we only passed 3 other climbers the whole day, my group of people. But instead of using the trails with the switchbacks so that you could take your time and adjust more to the altitude better, we picked a line that just went straight up the mountain, and because we're walking on the snow and the trails are non-existent. And it was one of the hardest climbs that I had done because I really underestimated that mountain since it wasn't very tall. And when I got to the top, like the way that I had designed my weightlifting was completely not for that kind of work. And I thought, well, I can just kind of rely on my base as an athlete, like you talked about. No. So I learned a lesson like, no, I'm lifting for life. I like to be strong. At the same time, I'm never going to have to move a 400-pound stone from a cave.
Hopefully.
But I will maybe have to walk up a mountain for 6 hours, and that I need to be able to do. So my training's obviously geared more for that, or sparring or fighting or something.
Yeah, I mean, if you fundamentally think about it, the idea of being able to be strong and lift heavy things or be really explosive it's really the opposite end of the spectrum of being able to do something at a low level for a very long period of time. And the reason the body adapts to those specifically is because there is such a big difference. So if we look at, like, let's say I want to lift a super heavy rock, right, in the form of a dumbbell or whatever, the barbell, I should say, the reality is that takes a lot of muscle, and it takes a lot of muscle working together at the same time. And it takes a lot of energy in a very short period of time, right? So it's maximum muscle mass contracting all together, and all this stuff happening. Blood, oxygen is not really a big deal because it's only for a few seconds. Now, if we look at the opposite, like let's go hike 6 or 7 hours up a mountain. If I have a ton of muscle mass, burning a ton of energy, it's not very good for my endurance. So there's a reason, bodybuilders aren't hiking up Mount Fuji very often, because they have so much muscle. It takes a massive amount of energy for them to go up that thing. So from a fundamental, specificity point, like you said, being able to go a long period of time means being very efficient, not having a lot of muscle mass, having a very well-developed cardiovascular system. That's what makes you really good at those things. Being really strong, really powerful, and really fast means lots of muscle mass. Cardiovascular is not as nearly as important, and it's going to be very different. So yeah, the body just adapts to what you're trying to do. That's why it's hard. The idea of CrossFit was a good idea, that like, let's be good at everything. It's not really how they executed it, but it's hard to be good at everything, because the better you get at one thing, you start to compromise your ability to do other things. That's really what it comes down to. So it just depends what people's goal is. That's
been kind of my goal my whole life, is to have a physique like Arnold, but be able to run like a 3-hour marathon or something.
I mean, that's really, really, really hard.
Which obviously these two things are mutually exclusive. They do not.
Yeah. It's basically like, hey, I want a 700 horsepower truck that gets 50 miles a gallon. Like it's the same thing. Like figure that when you figure that out, let us know how it works. Like it just doesn't happen.
Let's talk
that
about
way.
recovery then, with training. Obviously, as you're training, everything's taxing the nervous system in one way or another. So when you're setting up recovery systems, whether it's a hobbyist or an elite athlete, and let's say, they're a hobbyist in the cardiovascular realm. So if you're training somebody who would be a marathon runner, 5K, 10K runner versus an athlete like myself, like a mixed martial artist versus say a bodybuilder. The recovery methods or the training methods for these are vastly different, but the recovery methods, because each of these training methods tax the nervous system in different ways. So what kind of recovery methods do you use for each of these different kind of athletes? Are they the same, similar, different?
Well, we start talking about recovery. I think we have to back up and talk about how does training work in the first place. And in order to talk about that, we have to understand energy. This is a really important thing I think people miss out. When you train, you're putting your body under stress, and you're causing the body to have to get better at adapting to that stress. And the way that it does that is during the period of rest, right? Like you don't get stronger in the gym. You don't get more fit in the gym. You get stronger in between the periods of time when you go to the gym. That's really in the recovery phase. Now, what people don't realize though, is that both take a lot of energy, right? So everyone goes to the gym. They look at how many calories they burn. Like I burned 800 calories this workout. Like you pay a lot of attention to how much energy you burn in the gym. But what you don't realize is it takes extra energy to recover as well, because it takes energy going into the form of new proteins and putting tissues back into place and making bigger muscles. All that also takes energy. So the process of training and getting stronger and more fit and all that sort of stuff, it's a very energy intensive thing, not just to train, but the recovery. The problem that most people don't realize is the way our metabolisms, the way our body's systems around energy work is very different than how we think it does. So inherently, I think if I go, let's say I do 20,000 steps a day. I'm wearing Fitbit or I'm wearing Apple Watch, whatever. You think, okay, I went 20,000 steps a day. Like I must have burned a lot of calories, right? Well, tomorrow I'm going to go 40,000 steps. I'm going to burn twice as many calories, right? Well, no, actually you're not. So over time, the body is only able to produce a certain amount of energy in a given day. I won't go too far down the science, but it's called the constrained model of energy. Basically what it says is metabolism and your ability to create energy is limited. You can only create a certain amount of it every 24 hours. And it's up to your body, basically your brain to figure out how to use that. Now, what that means is that for training, for activity, for just sustaining your life and you're keeping your organs functioning, you have a finite amount of energy. Your body can only produce, like I said, about 2.5 times your basic metabolic rate. If you guys know what that is, or anyone knows what that is, that's about the maximum amount of energy your body can produce in a given day. So let's say it takes me 2,000 calories a day to just survive and keep my organs functioning. I can only burn total about 2.5 that in a day, produce. So the point being, if I go do a really high intensity workout, I'm really super active, I'm not going to have as much energy left over to recover time and time again, if that makes sense. So what I'm trying to come down to is I look at recovery in the standpoint of not just, okay, I train and then I do some recovery method. It's more about the total picture of how much energy somebody's expending, how well they're eating, how much they're sleeping, how active. Just all of that drives recovery, not just like go home and take a cold shower or go get a massage or whatever. It's the big picture. It's again, how much energy is someone burning a given day, how frequently are they doing high intensity work, what does their nutrition status look like, how many hours of sleep are they getting, all of these things, how much stress are they under is a big piece of just mental stress. All of that drives recovery. So the point being, before we go into like a methodology of we're going to use this method or that method, it's people have to understand the big picture of training and recovery as this whole thing that gets connected together by lifestyle. So my point is, a lot of times people are trying to find these recovery modalities when their lifestyle sucks, right? They're like sleeping 6-7 hours a night. Their diet is crap. And then they're like, well, I'm going to go get an ice bath. Well, okay, but your recovery is not limited by your ice bath, dude. Like your recovery is limited because your life sucks, because you're not getting sleep, because you're drinking every night, because, you're stressed out of your mind at work. So the whole point is, it's kind of like this. People want to have this mentality nowadays of like, I'm going to do these things externally to promote recovery, but your training sucks and your life sucks.
So you're gonna go spend extra money on something like cryotherapy, and
yes, exactly. It's the same thing.
It's
like,
not cheap.
Yeah, Yeah, exactly. It's like you're going to go eat a bunch of shitty food, but take supplements, right?
Right.
It's the same
You don't
thing.
know how
So
many, you don't,
I
you
try
don't
to
know
get
how many diets, like people that come to me that like, hey man, I need help with my nutrition, and they, they'll want to take a bunch of supplements. I'm like, yeah, but you're drinking Coca-Cola all day long. Like this is counterproductive.
exactly.
You're wasting your money here. So
yeah, so it just comes down to lifestyle is the limiting factor for most people's recovery, because it's where all their energy is being expended. Their energy is being expended on being stressed out from work. Their energy is being expended on not sleeping properly. Their energy is screwed up from not eating well. And then they're trying to, train too much to begin with. And then they're like, oh, I'm gonna go do cryo. I'm gonna go get a massage. Like, okay, well, go do it, but that's really not the problem. So I think that's kind of the starting point for talking about recovery is, what's your lifestyle look like? What does your training look like? Let's figure those things out first, and then add in recovery modalities as necessary.
Let me go back to a comment you made about expending energy, though. You said that you could expend 2.5 times of energy in a day. Let's just say that you have two completely different kind of athletes, the bodybuilder and the marathon runner, and they both train for the day. And let's just say that they both calorically expend the same amount of energy. Okay, just for the sake of this example. Recovery for the two of them, is it the same? Or because I would imagine, even though it's calorically, like the amount of energy that's been used, it still has to stress the body differently, or would it not? I mean, I could imagine that running a marathon can be, from a hormonal standpoint with cortisol and adrenaline, all that kind of stuff, is just as taxing on the body as doing a powerlifting meet or strongman contest where you burned equal amounts of energy. So is this assumption of mine true? Or
yeah, I mean, all things being equal, if you both burn the same amount of calories in a day, you both put the body in the same level of stress, even in different ways, the recovery is going to be very similar. Now that said, a very high intensity power lift is a bit different than, a 5K run, even though they might end up with, if you did enough sets of the heavy lifts, it might end up at the end of the day somewhat similar. The difference being the central nervous system takes a little bit longer to recover than the muscular system if it's at lower intensity. So there are some differences in how the energy was expended, whether it was maximum load CNS intensive stuff, or it was lower intensity for longer durations. There is some differences in terms of how those systems were taxed and how long they take to recover. But all things being equal, yeah, it's going to take roughly, the same amount of energy to repair that over time. It's going to take roughly the same amount of overall recovery ability, if that's a word, for both situations. It just depends on what you did.
When you talk about the same amount of energy, I'm assuming you're talking about like calories in, because that's how we consume our energy.
Yeah, calories in, or it can come internally, right? We can burn our own body fat. We can burn our own protein.
But we're trying to keep.
But so the interesting, if your listeners want to dig a little bit more into this, they can look up. There's some research by a guy named Dr. Herman Ponzer. He's kind of the one that found this basic principle. It's a really interesting story. So he was trying to answer the question of how many more calories a hunter-gatherer tribe would burn on average than kind of your average sedentary Westerner, right? So obviously people in the West are kind of lazy relative to somebody who's a hunter-gatherer. Like hunter-gatherers are out hunting and gathering while we're sitting around watching Netflix. So this guy, Herman Ponzer, decides he wants to understand from a caloric standpoint, how many more calories do these guys burn that are out in the field and being hunter-gatherers than we do sitting around in our average Western societies. So he goes down and he finds this tribe called the Hadza tribe, and they're one of the kind of the few remaining tribes out there that are completely hunter-gatherer type lifestyle tribes. And so he goes down there. He uses a really sophisticated technique to measure how many calories they burn in a day, and then he comes back. He crunches all the numbers, and things don't make sense to him. He's like, "This doesn't make sense because on average they didn't really burn any more calories per day than the average Westerner, given relative body weight. So if you take a 180-pound Western, you take a 180-pound hunter-gatherer, for some reason, they didn't seem to burn really any more calories. It didn't make any sense to him. So he thought, well, maybe they're not as active as we thought they are. Maybe we just completely misread how active hunter-gatherer type tribes are compared to Westerners. So maybe they're actually less active than we thought they were. So he goes back down. He does the study again, but this time he uses basically like a Fitbit, a pedometer, and measures their activity level. And he finds that actually they're massively more active than the average Western person. They were far more active. They went way more steps than the average Westerner. But he crunches the numbers again, and he finds the same thing, that even though they were far more active than we were on average, they didn't really burn any more calories, which is very odd. Like that's a very counterintuitive thing to think someone who's out, hunting and gathering is not really burning a ton more calories than kind of your average Western person just living
I'm
their
waiting
life.
I'm waiting for the but here because I'm completely.
No, there is no but. That
That's
literally
it,
is
that's
it.
it.
I mean, that's it. Like your body, you would think that like the more active you are, the more total energy you're expending in a day. But that's not what happens because again, it's finite. Your body just can't produce endless amounts of energy. So the more active you are, the more calories you put towards activity, the more you're pulling calories away from somewhere else is the point. Like if you can only burn or you can only produce 4,000 calories in a day, if I spend 2,000 of those on activity, I've got 2,000 to use somewhere else.
And then beyond that, you've just topped out.
Yeah, exactly. Like your metabolism just tops out. So what it basically means is like, if I'm really active in the day and I'm doing a heavy workout and I'm stressed out from my work, I don't have that many calories left over to recover from. Calories start to be pulled away from somewhere else just to survive. So this is the reason why if you start overtraining, you're under lots of stress, your sex drive goes down, your immune system gets compromised. You start to be foggy, your memory doesn't work as well. It's basically because you don't have enough calories to do all those things. You don't have enough calories to recover, to have good hormone production. You don't have good calories left over to have good brain function. Basically, your brain just starts pulling calories away from vital function to just maintain this, this level of lifestyle that you're way overdoing. So it's just, again, you were burning more calories from like activity standpoint, but you're pulling calories away from recovery. You're pulling calories away from immune function. You're pulling calories away from reproductive function. You're pulling calories away from other things to meet the needs of your activity. Does that make sense?
Okay. So let me ask you then, like take like an endurance runner, for example, who is, they run these crazy races. Actually, I had Joe DeCina, the Spartan race owner. Yep. He was on and he had told a story about how he accidentally signed up for, I think, 3 different endurance races in the same week. He didn't realize when he was signing up for these things, they all happen to be in the same week. And so if you're running these endurance races, surely you have to, in a full 24-hour period, burn more calories than that 2.5 time.
Yeah. So basically what it comes down to is you can do these sorts of things for very short periods of time. So the same researcher I mentioned, Herman Ponzer, did this thing where he looked at different types of endurance events and he looked at stuff like that, where it's like half day event, full day event to like a 30-day event to like 6 months. I mean, these crazy different distances in terms of endurance capabilities. And basically we found that you can exceed that 2.5 times limit, but only in very short events. When they looked at like these like 4-month treks and 6-month treks and like these 30-day, like, Tour de France type things, you basically end up right back at that 2.5 times over time. So you can essentially only go above that 2.5 times thresholds for very short periods of time. Now, ultimately, the body can't do it for very long for whatever reason. It's just a byproduct of how our metabolism works, that it can exceed it, but only for very short periods of time.
You're working out, you're burning your calories, and you're patting yourself on the back, and now it's time to recover. And let's just assume that the people that we're talking to now are the people that are sleeping, that are eating at least fairly properly, not drinking, not out late at night, all the stuff they need to be doing. And then they throw.
There's a small percentage of people talking to you now.
I guess. Where there's a lot of people on that would be listening that would want to strive towards that, I guess. So and I guess the lesson learned here would be, if you don't have your house in order that direction, don't go spending money on things like cryogenic therapy, ice baths. I would say massage therapy from a recovery standpoint, but then again,
part of recovery is just turning on the body's recovery system, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. Things that promote that are generally good. So by that, I mean relaxation and meditation and massage therapy, like float tanks, like things that help your body just relax and turn on the recovery system are generally low cost, for the most part. They're easier. Those things are good. But going out and
back up because you threw parasympathetic system out there, like it's just like it's a common thing. So let's explain the parasympathetic system.
Yeah. So your body's got 2 parts of what's called the autonomic nervous system. All right. You've got the fight or flight system, which most people are aware of. They heard of, you've heard like picking cars off of babies. That's just the fight or flight system, like cranked to maximum and adrenaline shoots to the roof when you pull a car for a kid and you blow your biceps off the process. But that fight or flight system is active anytime you are active, basically. Anytime you're walking around, it's active a little bit. If you're lifting weights, it's active a whole lot more. But basically that fight or flight system, it's called the sympathetic branch of that nervous system. Its job is to produce calories to deal with the stress you put your body under. So again, lifting weights, walking point A to point B, just moving around, your body needs more energy than it does when you're resting. And the sympathetic system turns up and produces more energy and allows you to do those things. Now, the other side of that is called the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. It's the rest and digest piece of it. So that system's job is to take energy and convert it into better muscle tissue and better immune function and reproductive system, more efficient and more better. Its job is basically to do what it says: rest, repair, digest, adapt, all that sort of things. And you have these two systems always working. They basically are there to guide energy, right? So if I'm going to go lift weights, or I'm going to go do a cardiovascular workout, or I'm going to go whatever that requires energy, my sympathetic system kicks on and it puts energy in that direction, right? If I'm going to do something like sleep, or I'm going to just lay on the couch, I'm not as active. I don't need as many calories going towards movement. So the parasympathetic system kicks on and helps my body recover, and it puts energy back into energy storage. So for the bodybuilding audience out there, they're familiar with words anabolic and catabolic, which people probably have heard. Anabolic means you're building tissues up. In order to build those tissues up, you need the parasympathetic system driving energy into those tissues to build them up. Catabolic is the sympathetic system. It's breaking energy down and giving it to your working muscles so they can do whatever they're doing, right? So, like I said, if we're talking about just the average person's recovery, the simple thing to do is just allow your body to relax more, because big part of our recovery problems is we're spun up all the time. So it's not just a workout that drives our heart rate up and that drives that sympathetic system. It's being stressed about work all day long and watching TV and looking at COVID every 2 minutes. Our society drives our stress and takes energy away from recovery in ways that most people don't understand. Because here's a really easy way to see it. Put on your heart rate, put on any kind of heart rate monitor and look at your heart rate where you're just kind of laying in bed. Now get up about your day, you'll see your heart rate moving around. If you're sitting there watching TV and you're thinking about work, your heart rate will be elevated. Your heart rate's elevated because that sympathetic system is turned on. And that means energy is not going towards recovery. It's going towards dealing with the mental stress you're dealing with. So people often don't understand mental stress is stress. Mental stress takes energy. That's why your blood pressure goes up. That's why your heart rate goes up, because you're under stress. So in general, like we're talking about recovery, the first thing to do before you worry about cryo and that sort of stuff is just learn how to relax more and learn how to tune out the noise and learn how to turn down that sympathetic system when you don't need it. In other words, become better at dealing with the mental side of the game and relax, stop watching TV that's stressful and learn how to, relax, meditate and, breathe and do all those sorts of things that just turn down that sympathetic flight or fight system when you don't need it, and allow that parasympathetic system that you do need to help drive energy towards recovery.
Let me ask you, because a lot of people don't realize this, just watching the news, for example, the news is designed to elicit some response out of you.
Absolutely.
They're not just reporting facts or a story or something like that, but then you have this controversial viewpoints on the news. And so just watching the news can be a stressful event.
Or social media, right? Social media drives your blood. I mean, all of the stimulus that we get on a daily basis is stressful. And it's not particularly good for us, specifically, especially these days.
People don't realize that. So it's these things that keep you out of your ability to recover.
Absolutely. It has a huge impact.
Let me ask you, just along those lines, say, for example, I go to watch a movie. Say it's an action movie, and the action movie is presenting all this action. And I get enjoyment out of this movie, but the fact that movie is high-paced, maybe it's a thriller, for example, and I'm kind of on the edge of my seat. Is that activating the fight or flight, the sympathetic system in some sort of way?
Absolutely. Well, there's some counterintuitive effects or some kind of countering effects there. Like you're definitely active from a sympathetic standpoint, but you're also getting the benefit of happiness. Happiness also has some benefit. That's a bit different than sitting and watching the news and something that's, stressful and a negative thing. Something that's, fun and exciting. Like, you are getting some sympathetic stress response. But people aren't unhealthy because they're sitting in movies all day. They're unhealthy because they're watching the news and they're strumming through social media and they're stressed about work. And, it's that sort of cumulative stress that's the real problem here. It's probably not like, hey, I went and watched, Fast and Furious 10 or 9 or whatever they're on these days and got stressed out because of car wrecks. I mean, that's probably the least of people's problems.
Then I'll ask you this. It's beginning of the year time. There's a lot of New Year's resolutions. We're few weeks into the new year at this point, and people are either succeeding or failing on their resolutions. I'm sure there are a lot of people that have gone out and bought things like Apple Watches, the Oura Rings, and all these different kinds of systems to help them with these different kinds of things. I mean, what are your thoughts on this for the average person? Keeping in mind, I know that they're beneficial, but keeping in mind, like we were talking about the average person who may not have their house in order, who is still out drinking, like same as cryotherapy. If I'm staying up late at night and drinking and doing the things I shouldn't be doing for relaxing, should I be spending the money or wasting the money, I should say, on something like an HRV system?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm a bit biased because I make the HRV system, but I'll talk about the value of it, what the role of it is. So I have a system called Morpheus. It measures HRV and then it pulls in activity and sleep. So the biggest thing I'll say that most of these systems do right now is they help just build some awareness. And so every system is, different. Every system does different things. What Morpheus does is gives you a recovery score, and then it looks at your sleep and your activity in these different areas and helps you make better decisions. So I would say really, this idea that all these wearables are like super smart fitness coaches, they're not there yet. That's not really what they're great at doing. They are good, at least, the better ones like Morpheus, at least making you aware of how sleep is maybe impacting your recovery, or how your training may be impacting your recovery, or how your activity on a daily basis. And it at least is helping to make somebody aware of how these things outside of the training sphere are impacting the results they see from that training. So the biggest thing I can tell you, and that, people see when they first start looking at this sort of data is, again, they realize that how much lifestyle matters. So when I used to do the old school method with you and a bunch of other people, like my Microsoft clients would come in and they would feel like, oh, I'm fine. I haven't worked out for a few days, but then you'd look at them and they were trashed because there was some big work deadline and they were up all hours and they were stressed out of their minds and they were drinking caffeine nonstop. And then they see like, wait a minute, my recovery is terrible. My HRV is terrible. What caused that? And then you explain to them, well, what caused that was you've been sleeping terribly and your nutrition's bad and you're stressed out of your mind. And that's having a big impact on your body. So I think the value in those things, if you pay attention to the numbers and do some research, is they can help make you more aware of all the things we've been talking about, because you will see your numbers go downhill if you drink too much. You will see your numbers go downhill because you're stressed mentally. You will see your numbers go downhill if you are doing too much intensity and you aren't recovering from that. So I think it helps from that broad spectrum, that broad perspective of becoming aware of what is and is not actually helping you. And then it's still up to you to figure out, how do I fix those things? That's what they're not very good at. And that's why I try to help build education. But right now, an Oura or a Fitbit or a Garmin, they can tell you, what the numbers look like, but they can't really tell you how to fix them. That's up to people to figure out the best ways for them to improve their lifestyle. Like I can tell you nutrition sucks, but an app can't really tell you how to fix that and make it last.
Yeah, I can tell you that your nutrition is bad, but I can't tell you exactly how to fix that nutrition, at least at this point in time.
Yep.
I don't know. The way the technology is moving, we're probably 6 months off of that, I would say,
Yeah. I mean, well, it's hard to say because, human behavior is human behavior. It's hard to tell someone what to do and like, people aren't robots. I can tell you what to do. It doesn't mean you're going to do it. Right. It is because all things are connected. So for a good example of this is if I don't sleep very well, I'm going to crave shittier foods. I'm going to crave sugar. I'm going to crave fat. I'm going to crave worse foods. If I'm under mental stress, I'm going to crave worse foods. So if I look at someone's diet and I say, hey, you're eating crappy food, stop eating those crappy foods. Like, is that the best advice? Or do I have to look down and say, look, maybe the reason you're eating terrible foods is you're not getting any sleep. Well, maybe the reason you're not getting any sleep is because you're stressed out from work and you're training too late at night and you're doing all these things. Like, it's this big cascade of things. So it's easy to say, hey, fix your diet and stop eating crappy foods. But the reality is maybe the biggest piece of that was because they're stressed out of their minds, they're not sleeping, their body was naturally pushed towards that craving. And that's a very hard thing to override. Maybe the answer is fix the things that are causing them to not get good sleep, fix the things that are causing that mental stress. And that's the way to fix their diet. But most people don't look at it that way.
You made me think of this as you're talking about stress. And obviously this is it's a big thing, stress in the corporate world or the working world or whatever. And I'm thinking about the comment that you made about the hunter-gatherers. Are not the hunter-gatherer type of tribes of people just under a tremendous amount of stress all day long? That's really no different. I know that would probably be more of a physical stress because they are hunting and they are gathering. But is it, because we talk about chronic stress, like the body is designed to experience stress in short spurts, and it's actually good for you in short spurts.
Yep.
But
yeah, exactly.
when you talk about these cultures of people and the research that like Dr. Ponzer, Yeah, that Dr. Ponzer
Yep.
did. Isn't the physical stress that they go to on a daily basis kind of somewhat equivalent to, say, the mental stress that a person would go through in the corporate world?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not, they're never hunter gathered in a way that was, the only way I could survive. So I can't answer it from that perspective, but I don't think so, actually. I mean, I think we are sitting there watching TV. We're worried about paying our bills. We've got bosses to answer to, we're seeing COVID cases spike. I mean, we live in a very interactive, stressful world that I don't think they are plugged into. I mean, I can tell you my life is more stressful with the cell phone, social media than ever was without it. So, I think that just avoiding the societal stress that we put ourselves under has got to be easier from a stress standpoint than not. And I'm sure that they have their own problems and their own worries. But I think that the rates of cardiovascular disease, the rates of diabetes, the rates of, all these things are massively higher in westernized countries, and our diets and the stress and all the things play a huge role in that. So, I think the answer is no, they're probably not as stressful. It's just, it's still they still got to survive, but I don't think they're worried every day about surviving. I think they pretty much got it figured out.
So let's say that you have a client that comes in, the hobbyist or even the elite athlete. I mean, we all deal with stress, right? When I was competing, even outside of my career, obviously I'm dealing with a tremendous amount of physical stress on a daily basis because I'm just grinding. But then there's everything else that comes with it. Everybody has personal issues in their life. You're dealing with, I have to win this next fight. I have a contract renegotiation. I got sponsors that are on the line for this, whatever these stresses may be. And so when you're dealing with, whether it's the elite athlete, hobbyist, I'm kind of assuming this applies to all categories of people. When you go to fix these things, these other factors that alter recovery, whether it's poor sleeping habits or an overload on stress, I don't know if you've actually been able to measure this with your Morpheus system, but have you had any clients where you've isolated a variable or two or three variables where you said, here are the things that are throwing you off? The stress that you carry at work, too much social media, or whatever it is. And somebody says, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put my phone down and log out of my social media accounts for the next week, 2 weeks, month, whatever. And have you actually been able to, with one of those systems, show a measurable difference over time? And if so, how long does that typically take to actually, so that you can see day one, like, here's your typical life. Here's what recovery was like for you. Now, 3 weeks later or whatever, you've eliminated this, and this, and here's the recovery differences, and how much difference does that make?
Yeah. So you can see it very, very clearly because without going too far to the science of heart rate variability, like we mentioned briefly, heart rate variability, the number itself, it's a measure of the overall kind of average activity of that parasympathetic nervous system. In other words, it's a measure of how much energy your body's able to drive into recovery. So if that number is very low, it means your body's not able to put much energy into recovery because you're so overloaded with stress. If that number is higher, it means your body's able to put more energy towards recovery. And generally speaking, people with higher HRV can handle stress better because their body's better at that in general. So we can use this kind of average HRV number over time to see how people are responding, to see if they're getting better at dealing with stress or worse. And so, all the time, you can see some very quick changes in their HRV based on all those factors you mentioned. If all of a sudden someone's sleep improves over a week, you can see a noticeable rise and improvement in their HRV. If someone finds foods they're just eating that are terrible for them, you can find a big change in HRV. If someone's been way overtraining or way overstressed and they reduce that or eliminate that, HRV is the single best tool we have to see that exact thing you're talking about, because that will change in response to the overall stress.
Yeah, but I'm
load.
thinking more of like maybe some anecdotal evidence. I don't know if you've used yourself as a case study where you say, you know what, I'm going to put my social media away for a month and track yourself, like what your baseline is and how your normal daily activity is versus that of I've eliminated this factor, these couple factors, these variables in the system that can affect me. Do you have any anecdotal?
Yeah, I mean, I can look. I was just kind of give you a big picture. So, we've talked about go to Hawaii in the wintertime. My numbers in Hawaii, because I pay less attention to social media, and I'm in Hawaii, right? I'm just in a more relaxed atmosphere. My numbers are systematically across the board, and performances and every other marker are noticeably better when I'm deplugged from the stress of the where I'm at versus I'm in Hawaii. And I can just tell you in general, people in Hawaii are happier. There is less stress in Hawaii. There is less social pressure. I don't flip the news channels over there and see as much about the same stuff I see here. It's just a more relaxing environment from unplugging from the stress of Seattle's a fairly stressful place. People are not as happy here as they are in in Hawaii. It's funny when I'm in Hawaii, you hear all these commercials on the radio about like gastrointestinal problems and bad food, but in Seattle, it's about mental health and are you depressed and you feeling suicidal? Call this number. Like it's a very different set of problems you face in Seattle than you do in Hawaii from a mental stress standpoint. So just anecdotally, my numbers are massively better across the board from unplugging from just the stress in Seattle and home versus a place like Hawaii. And I've seen that it happens all the time. People go on vacation, they can't use their phone because it's in a different country, or they're not paying attention to social media because they're just on vacation, and their numbers almost universally get better. Aside from the travel piece of it, their numbers improve dramatically. So you can absolutely see a direct response when you do kind of take yourself out of that stress of the daily grind that you put yourself in.
Yeah,
normally.
I think that would be my message, I guess, to the listeners here is that anybody who's set a New Year's resolution, particularly with, I don't know, there's always New Year's resolutions around losing weight and fitness goals and stuff like that. It's like challenge yourself for a week or a month or whatever you can afford to unplug from that kind of stuff and just say, I'm not going to use my phone more than X number of hours a day, or I'm going to log out of my social media for this month and just see what it does.
We talked about the cabin I used to have. So my cabin was like the perfect example because I didn't have internet up there. I literally could not get internet, right? So I had nothing. At the same point in time, I had a bedroom that had no windows. It was like the ultimate sleep room. There was no windows. It was dead quiet, a comfortable bed in there. I'd go up there for the weekend and not pay any attention to internet because I didn't have it. I didn't really do any work, and I'd get incredible sleep. And I'd come back from a day or two of that, and my numbers were just tremendously different. Everything was better. My performance was better. I mean, you see this massive difference from both.
So if you make an adjustment like that, whatever it is that a listener might be dealing with, you're talking just within a couple of days that your numbers would. This is not something that takes months of time. I mean, obviously, a process like building muscle takes months, years of work. Even improving your cardiovascular system takes weeks, months of work. But this is days worth of work and
days. Absolutely, it takes days. I mean, even just being in a place that you can mentally tune out and relax from in a day can have a noticeable impact on your numbers. Now, again, the problem is it's transient. If you go back to it with stress, you didn't magically fix the problem. You just got away from it for a while. So, in general, if people want to live a healthier, longer life, you just have to learn how to deal with stress more effectively. And obviously, we all have stress we have to deal with. And exercise can be a very positive way to do that. But you have to just be able to develop skills around tuning the noise out, whether that's being less active in social media, whether that's spending 2 days a week without looking at your phone, whether that's having a place you can go to that's relaxing for you, whether that is, just taking an hour of your day to just stop paying attention to the outside environment and read a book or do something you find relaxing. I mean, just breaking the chain. The problem is people sit there for 16, 18 hours a day in stress state and they go to sleep. Like they don't find any point in time during the day to break that cycle. And even I've seen people's numbers just get better from literally, I said, okay, look, like someone's at Microsoft, they're like, man, I'm stressed all day at work. I was like, hey, look, I want you twice a day to go outside, and Seattle's beautiful in spring and summer. I just want you to go for a walk. Like leave your phone on your desk, go for a walk, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever you can afford. Just leave your phone at your desk and go for a walk or listen to music or do something. And just doing that sort of pattern interruption stuff can make a big difference. Like it takes time, but you can actually see a real noticeable difference in people just taking a fairly small amount of time of their day to just break that like nonstop deluge of stress.
Let me give you an example. So I have this theory that I can deal with stress better than say the average person, or at least certain types of stress, right? Because so I'm pressure tested, and because I've been pressure tested with my career, I'm used to being in high stressful situations. I mean, you know what it's like. You've been in plenty of locker rooms. You've been in my locker room. So before you're about to walk out, like that's about the most stressful thing that you can go through, and you willingly put yourself
being shot at. Yes,
I agreed with you on being shot at. I've never been I have been in a war zone, but I've never been in a combat situation in a war zone. So, but it's a highly stressful time, and you willingly put yourself in this situation, or even you bring that a good point up as military personnel. I was talking to a friend of mine who was a Marine that served in Somalia, and he told me about the first time that they ever got shot at. He was freaking out. And then he said, it's amazing how quickly you adapt to such a thing, because within like a week, there are just bullets flying overhead, and they don't even think anything of it. It's like, another day they're shooting at us. And so these people that are able to deal with this stress, it's like, if you're still able to deal with the stress, is it having the same negative effect, like day one of getting shot out versus week one or month one or year one of getting shot at, where you're just kind of like, whatever? Is that the same amount of taxation on the nervous system in both situations?
The answer to that is it's not stress, right? If it's not causing a reaction in the body, then it's not stress to you, because stress is completely relative. If I have a fear of spiders and my heart rate spikes through the roof, if a spider gets on me, but they don't bother you at all, that spider is real stressful to me. It's not stressful to you. So we can define stress literally as our reaction to our environment.
Okay.
So if your heart rate's not spiking and you're not feeling the stress of the situation, then by definition, that's not very stressful to you. So you're getting better with dealing with the environment that we're in, is the best way to put it. You find the overall environment less stressful, and that manifests itself in lower heart rates and better health and everything else. Somebody who is worse at dealing with the environment, that is much more stressful to them. Their heart rates are higher. They get a much stronger reaction to that stimulus. So really the question is just, how good are we dealing with the environment we're put in? And some people can tune the noise out. Some people can maintain an inner calm, even though everything is chaotic around them. And some people can't. And that is the skills that you develop because you as an athlete were put in these situations where you had to be able to deal with an environment most people would find extremely stressful. All people would find stressful, and you're able to tune that out enough to focus on just doing your job. And you probably know as well as anybody, and you take someone who's let's say it's their very first fight in the UFC, right? You're scared out of your damn mind compared to someone who's been in the game for 5-10 years. I mean, don't get me wrong. You're obviously still, you're still fight or flight, but it's not the same as somebody who's just walking in the arena for the very first time, the bright lights. I mean, those are different things. You developed the ability to tolerate that more over time.
I actually think I went the opposite direction. I think I was too stupid to realize the situation I got myself in for my first fight. And then by the end of my career, I realized how much was actually riding on every single fight. And so I was probably,
I mean, there is a lot more, at your level, there was a lot riding on the last fight, probably more than the first fights. But just in general, the more you're exposed to something, the more you develop the ability to cope with that something, military or fights or whatever else. But it also has to be somewhat of a conscious effort. I mean, I know you went through a lot of work with Brian Cain and you put in work being able to learn how to deal with that. A lot of people, they don't, and they just kind of go about their life and they deal with the stress every day. And then they die of cardiovascular disease when they're 60 and they wonder why. I'll tell you this. Well, they don't wonder why.
One of the comments you made about dealing with stress and about the reaction to the environment is that I think that particularly with chronic stress, and you talk about people at work and stuff like that, is people in these situations don't realize that their body is actually reacting to the stress. Right? Because for example, if I got shot at, my heart rate's going to spike, like it's going to spike like I'm in a fight. But if my boss at work is yelling at me, then I'm just like, whatever. But that's kind of I guess, a poker face in essence, but there's still a reaction on the inside. Not the same reaction that I would get from being shot at or getting in a fight, but there is a reaction. But when you have that reaction, and that reaction is all day long, and what you don't realize is that you do have a higher heart rate. And going back to the question I asked about systems like your Morpheus system and stuff like that, that's what it would make you aware of like, wow.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like, so the biggest thing with HRV, I started using, I've been using almost 20 years now. And that was the biggest thing that I noticed myself and everybody else is you would see, a really interesting thing. We would see, I tested a bunch of soccer players year round. Right. And you would think that like, tournament play and travel and playoffs, like you would think that would be the most stressful thing that a soccer player could go under, right? As a college soccer player. But the answer was no, it was finals week. Finals week absolutely crushed these soccer players. And so once we were showing the coach this, the coach was like, I had no idea like how much mental stress was having an impact on my athletes. So, they're able to completely change the training during finals week and do a whole bunch of other stuff to try to get them to just not be quite as bad. And training wouldn't add on top of that. So yeah, the reality is, training is, don't get me wrong, training is stressful, but for the average person, training is an hour a day, 45 minutes, whatever. It's a fairly short burst, but it's the other, 16 hours of life that adds up in a much bigger cumulative manner. So, I mean, you might burn 800 calories in a workout, 600 calories, that's still not, 20% of your calorie, 30%, whatever it may be. It's the other 60, 70%, 80% of your time that adds up. And if you look at a week, I mean, let's say the average person trains for 3 or 4 hours a week. That's a very small amount of stress in the grand scheme of your life. It's everything else that adds up, that's cumulative, like you mentioned. And we're living in a time now, I don't think we've ever, I can't think of a more stressful time. I didn't grow up in a wartime environment, which I'm sure had its own stresses, but COVID, for God's sakes, 2 or 3 years, of all the things that are happening in society, from people's jobs being up in order or all over the place, or losing their job, and arguing on the news and vaccine this. I mean, just the amount of stress that people are overloaded with right now is through the roof. And I guarantee you, we will see the repercussions of this down the road in terms of people's cardiovascular health. Not only are they under stress, but they've gained weight, right? Yeah. And they're related, obviously. But the average health of the average American has gone into the tank, which it was terrible to start with. So, if anything else, it's unfortunate, I think, that there hasn't been more attention brought to this. The actual health impact, I would say, of the stress of COVID is going to have a massive impact down the road, and probably even not
this
that
is something
far.
That they're going to talk about 30 years from now, type of thing, when you start seeing all these heart attacks.
Your listeners should all look up a guy named Robert Sapolsky. He's absolute genius. He's a professor of neurobiology and physiology at Stanford. And he's basically a behavioral biologist, and he's just a brilliant guy, but he's really kind of one of the godfathers or the grandfathers of our modern era of stress research and talking about stress. And he did a lot of stuff with apes and monkeys. And anyway, he mentioned a big study of in World War II, there was a big area where there was basically the Germans were in, I can't remember where they were exactly when they invaded, but there was this big area where the Dutch were deprived. There's this big famine for 6 or 9 months where the average calorie was 800 calories. And they could actually measure the effects of this stress on the babies that were essentially in different periods of development as the stress of lack of nutrition was impacting them. And they followed up over 20, 30, 40 years. And the babies that were, at a certain point of fetal development during this lack of food were 300 or 400 times more likely to get cardiovascular disease. They were 3 or 4 times more likely to get diabetes. Their lifespans were reduced, literally just the stress of being in the womb itself impacted them for their entire lives. So I guarantee you're going to see long lasting effects of all this sort of stuff play out down the road.
Let that be a reminder to the audience. It's the things that you did, all your actions, the repercussions of that lasts forever, right? The foods that you decide to eat as a young kid. I had this discussion with one of my previous guests about how growing up and eating things like sugared cereals and stuff like that. And now I'm man, and that choice wasn't mine, but I'll just say this. First of all, I'll say, I didn't think that when I was talking, you and I were talking about recovery and stuff like that, I didn't think the conversation was going to drift into stress and stress management, which is awesome.
Man, it's what recovery is about.
Yeah, but I'll say this, interestingly enough for me, this year, one of my resolutions this year is to make sure that I spend every morning and every night, and so far I've been successful to date, reading my Bible. And when I wake up in the morning, I'll start my day with that before I grab my phone, before I do any business, and at night after I go to bed. And I attempted to do this last year, and I was reading on an app. And the problem with reading on an app is you have the blue light that comes from your screen, as well as the temptation of, let me check my social media. So now I shut my phone off for the night. I put that thing down, and then I actually pick up paper pages and I read that. And that's my, 15, 20 minutes in the morning, my 15, 20 minutes at night, where, and those aren't the only times, but it's I'm going to add these things into my day on top of everything else that I do for my lifestyle. That's just where the whole world is otherwise shut off. And I think that's, if I was going to say one thing to the listeners out there, it's if your New Year's resolutions, this is something that you should either A, this is affecting why you're succeeding or not, and B, if it's not part of a New Year's resolution, incorporate it into what you're doing. I'll ask you this, Joel. So, for the listeners out there, where can they get information if somebody was interested in one of your Morpheus systems? Yeah,
just trainwithmorpheus.com. It's the easiest place. So, like I said, it measures their HRV, allows them to see how it impacts their recovery, get them heart rate zones. And I'm actually building the process of building courses. I want to build courses on HRV, courses on stress management, and really provide the education I think is missing in this day and time, because just like what you mentioned, it's finding things that help you cope with the stress or make it less stressful for you. And, having a tool to see, is this working? Is this not working? Is a really valuable way. It's a more efficient way to do it. You don't have to wait weeks and months to see if you feel better. You can see your numbers changing, on an hourly and daily and weekly basis. And one thing that's really cool too, like you just mentioned, that reading your Bible and tuning out is helping you, do that, tune out. You can look at heart rate to see whether or not something's relaxing to you. Heart rate will go down if something's relaxing. Heart rate will go up if something's not. So there's some really good ways, I think, to use tech in a smart way that make it just a faster process for you versus just trial and error. Like, is this stressful for me? I don't know. Well, look at your heart rate. If your heart rate goes up, it's stressful. If your heart rate goes down, it's relaxing. So there's lots of valuable things you can get out of using the technology when you're using it like that. Versus, unfortunately, I think a lot of people are just kind of using it because other people are, and they think it's cool, and they post on Instagram their band or their whatever. You have to use it in a meaningful way. You have to actually look at the numbers and try to learn from the numbers. And you say, hey, looks like my numbers are really impacted by caffeine late at night. I'm going to try a couple days and cut my caffeine back and see if my sleep improves. It's that sort of learning process that makes technology really effective. And it's, kind of the passive do nothing, just collect data. That's probably not worth it for you. So trainwithmorpheus.com is where people can find it. But the short answer is, if you are going to use it, do it in a meaningful way.
I invited my strength and conditioning coach on for my career today, but I ended up speaking with my psychology professor from my career today. So, that's awesome, man. No, all kidding aside, man. No,
it is. Well, I mean, it's my old age, right? I mean, I want to live at this point. It's funny when you're younger, you just want to perform better and you want to, get the top or whatever. But the older you get, the more you just want to live longer and you want to be healthier and you want to be able to do the things you enjoy for as long as possible. And then you also see people around you not make it. My mom passed away a few months ago, and the last 2 years of her life were just terrible. I mean, she was locked in a room for half of it. She, was miserable. And you just, I don't want to end up, where you have a stroke, where you have cardiovascular disease, you have all these problems. I mean, it isn't, think about this. 1/3 of the United States population will get cardiovascular disease in their life. 70% roughly of that has been shown to be preventable. So if we're talking about preventing deaths and preventing premature deaths and all these things, the most important thing you can do is learn how to deal with stress better, take care of yourself, eat, sleep, relax, recover. I mean, these lifestyle choices will literally dictate the end of your life in one way or another. So I think I've spent a lot more time researching that because of it.
I talk to my mom all the time about this, and that's what I really don't care about living longer. I don't care if I'm 100 years old. It's just that I want to make sure that I have a good quality of life the whole way through. I want to run across the finish line. I don't want to be dragged across it. And so that's my goal here. And that's your message for the day. So awesome.
It is my message for the day. Take care of yourself, and you will live, it's health span is a good term for it. You'll have a long, healthy health span versus, a long life with a terrible ending to it. You just do everything you can to avoid that.
Well, Joel, thanks for coming on today. Appreciate it, man. Had fun with the conversation.
Yeah, appreciate having me on.
Quite Franklin is providing this podcast as a public service, but it is neither a legal interpretation nor legal advice, nor a statement of Quite Franklin policy. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation of that product or entity by Rich Franklin or Quite Franklin. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by Quite Franklin employees or representatives are the views and opinions of the persons expressing them, and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Quite Franklin or any of its officials or principals. Nothing heard on this podcast at any time is medical advice or is intended as medical advice. The listener must always consult his or her personal physician or other qualified medical professional regarding any questions of a medical nature. If you have any questions about this disclaimer, please contact our general counsel.